Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'd like to thank the organizers for the invitation for this session. I'm over the moon that Eileen Fisher is one of the keynote speakers at this edition of the CCB, and I'm really honored to moderate this session. Before I open the floor to Eileen, the organizers asked me to read this disclaimer. All statements expressed by Fundação Getúlio Vargas employees and guests in our online events and broadcasts exclusively represent their opinions and not necessarily FGV's institutional position. We also reiterate that everyone present here agreed to participate in this event of their own free will, and they consented to be recorded in this broadcast, which will be posted later on FGV's official channels. They also asked me to remind you that you can submit your questions via the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. If you feel more comfortable posting your question in Portuguese, please go ahead and I will do my best to translate it. All right. So our guest today is Eileen Fisher. Eileen is a professor of marketing and the Anne and Max Tannenbaum Chair in Entrepreneurship and Family Enterprise at the Schulich School of Business out of York University in Toronto, Canada, where she's also the director of the PhD program. Her work on how brands, firms, and markets emerge and evolve, and on how consumers and entrepreneurs shape them and respond to them, has been featured in myriad top-tier marketing and management journals, many of which she has also go on to lead. She has indeed been an important voice and leader in the field, having previously served, for example, as the editor of the Journal of Consumer Research, president of the Association for Consumer Research, and president of the Consumer Culture Theory Consortium. Throughout her career, Eileen has published influential work on how research contributions can be constructed using qualitative methodologies. So we are thrilled to have her here to share her insights on enabling theories with us today. Welcome, Eileen.
Thank you so much, Luciana. And I'm just going to share my screen. There we go. And there we are. Can everybody see my screen okay? I'm going to assume that you can. Great, thank you. Thanks, Luciana. Okay, well, first of all, let me say thank you very much for the invitation to present here. I really appreciate it. And I'm hoping that there will be value in this talk for everybody. I wanted to start this talk with a bit of a background on where this phrase enabled theory building even came from. I came up through the consumer research community, but with the incredible privilege of having served as a reviewer on many papers at multiple journals over the years, and having had a long stint as an AE at the Journal of Consumer Research and handling a lot of qualitative papers there. Sometime around 2009 or 2010, Russ Belk asked Rob Kosinitz and I to co-author a textbook with him. And it fell to me to write the chapter on analyzing data. And that was a great opportunity for me because it allowed me to articulate an observation that I had about how we actually build theory that I couldn't find in any of the textbooks I was familiar with. And parenthetically, I've been teaching qualitative methods to the doctoral students at Schulich for almost 25 years. So I was pretty familiar with all the guidance that was out there about how do you build theory using qualitative data. And it struck me that in practice, I was observing something that no one was really writing about. So I wrote a bit about enabled theory building in the textbook that Russ Belk, Rob Kosinitz, and I published in 2012. And I've been thinking a lot and writing a lot about it ever since. And I will say that I do understand that this is not a practice that's unique to qualitative researchers in the consumer research field. It's something that you can observe across qualitative researchers in other fields, but certainly our sister fields of management, strategy, accounting, etc. but their guidance, their textbooks, which I look at routinely, don't say much about it either. So I feel that this is a practice that is common, that has gone largely unreflected. And I acknowledge that, because what I want to say is I didn't make this up, but I think I've been instrumental along with other colleagues in naming it and trying to figure out how the practice works, and hopefully in trying to codify the practice, not to institutionalize it, not to make it something that can't be violated, but rather to increase our level of reflexivity as we engage in this when it's appropriate to do so. And I really want to underscore that last point. I'm going to say it over and over again. This is really about understanding enabled theory building when it's appropriate to do so, and sometimes it's not. The next thing I want to do, given that background, is just clarify the premises that I'm starting from. So what I'm going to be talking about is using approach to theory building, and I regard theory building as what we do qualitative research for. I know that there are other reasons why people do qualitative research, but my talk today and my own practice and most of my publication career has been really geared towards building theory through the analysis of qualitative data. That's one starting premise. The second is that, you know, this process of building theory is an open and iterative one. And I've included this diagram here, which is part of a forthcoming paper that I've co-authored with one of my current doctoral students who's about to graduate, Gulay Taltokan Güzel. She and I worked on this paper to try and offer readers of the Journal of Consumer Psychology a very simplified version of the qualitative research process. But I included here to make the point that drawing on enabled theorizing is something that can happen pretty much at any point in this process that's abstracted here. So that's just my starting premise. So to get into it, what do we mean when we say enabled theorizing? So here's the definition that we used, and by we, I mean Pierre-Jan Dolbeck, Robin Caniford, and I, in a paper that we recently published in Marketing Theory. And full disclosure, a lot of this talk draws on what was published in that paper. So for more details, you can look at that paper. But I just want to go over the definition that we worked out as we were working on this project. So for us, and I think it's a good working definition, enabled theorizing means using pre-existing theoretical perspectives, theories, or conceptual lenses to inform various moments in the conduct of qualitative research. So it could be at any point and in any way. Just to clarify what I mean by a theoretical perspective, a conceptual lens, or theory, I'm really referring here to a set of precepts, ideas, or perspectives that probably exists outside the field of marketing. So there are many such perspectives. We'll talk about some of them today. But when we talk about enabled theorizing, we're talking about drawing on theoretical perspectives that are not unique to or specific to marketing, but rather that come from outside marketing to help us better understand marketing and consumer research phenomenon. And if I know we're not going to take questions during the talk, but I know when I've spoken about this in live audiences before, this has been something about which there have been questions. So if anybody's got a question about that and wants to put it in the Q&A bar, please do that. I'd be really happy to come back to what I mean by an enabling lens or an enabling theory. Moving on from there, I just wanted to give an example of the use of just one very simple, straightforward use of an enabling theory. So Diane Scarabato, another Schulich grad and dear friend, and a fellow Brazilian, we're working on a paper in the early 200s on an online community called Fashionistas. And as we worked on that, the question that really emerged for us was why and how do marginalized consumers, the fashionistas, mobilize to seek greater inclusion in and more choice from mainstream markets? What became very clear to us as we worked on that paper was that institutional theory, a pre-existing perspective that exists outside marketing, was going to be really helpful in answering these questions. And I use the lens metaphor. It opened our eyes. So putting on the lens of institutional theory opened our eyes to how consumers were being inspired by institutional entrepreneurs, which is a concept from institutional theory, how they were leveraging institutional logics to make change, and how they were aligning with more powerful institutional actors. A lot of the things that we were seeing at a kind of a descriptive level, we could make sense of at a conceptual level by putting on the lens of institutional theory. But, and here's the key point, we could also have probably written this paper without any enabling lens. We chose not to, and we definitely could have used different enabling lenses than institutional theory. For instance, we could have used new social movements theory, or we could have used a Foucauldian perspective. And to be clear, our reviewers suggested that we ought to do so. We stuck with our original instinct to go with institutional theory, and we think it was very valuable for us to do so in this particular paper. But we could have worked without an institutional theory lens. We could have worked without an enabling lens at all. So it's a choice that you make. And that leads me to my next slide, which is this. Do you need an enabling lens to build theory from analyzing qualitative data? Absolutely not, is the question. I cannot reinforce this enough. I know that some of the stuff that I've written earlier has been misconstrued as arguing that you must have an enabling lens to build theory from qualitative data. It is not true, and I really want to clarify that as forcefully as I possibly can. So I'll keep saying it and saying it. And anyone who suggests that an enabling lens is always necessary is, I think, misguided. So what I'll be talking about then is how to use one, when you should use one, when you want to use one, when you feel it would be helpful in analyzing your data. So we, in working on the paper with Robin and Pierre, we came up with a few different ways that you can make contributions using enabling theories. I'm going to just stick with the two that to me are most familiar, that I've seen most often, that I think are most readily appropriated by folks out there in the community. There are the two that I'm going to talk about are furthering ongoing conceptual conversations and advancing an enabling theory in itself. And I'm going to elaborate on each of these in the next couple of slides. So what do I mean by furthering ongoing conceptual conversations? This is, I think, the most common thing that you'll see people doing when they're using enabling theories. What it means is bringing new insights to bear on conceptual topics of interest within the marketing or consumer research literature. And I've given just 3 examples here: branding, market shaping, taste. I could go on and on and on. I think if you're familiar with the conversations in the pages of Journal of Consumer Research, Journal of Marketing Research, you will see lots of conversations that are specific to the marketing field, but that can be advanced when we use an enabling lens to analyze qualitative data to contribute to those ongoing conceptual conversations in our field. And just to give a specific example, Zeynep Arslan and Jonathan Bean, when they were writing about taste, they extended the conversation on taste by drawing on the enabling lens of practice theory. They noted that there weren't many theories on how individuals convert taste into practice and on the everyday performances of taste. And by drawing on this well-developed body of theory called practice theory, which existed outside marketing for a long time, they were able to make some really nice original contributions to the conversation on taste by specifying and delineating the processes that create and sustain taste regimes. Just to keep things clear, I would argue that the Scarabato and Fisher example that I just gave is another example of furthering an ongoing conceptual conversation. In that case, the conversation that we were that we were furthering was the then relatively new conversation on market shaping, or market systems dynamic, as it's also known. So there's lots of examples of furthering ongoing conceptual conversations using enabled theorizing. The other possibility, and we do see some of this in marketing, is in advancing the enabling theory itself. So although the theory can exist outside marketing, we can, within marketing, as long as it's appropriate to the journal readers, we can advance the enabling theory itself. This might mean adding novel concepts, or identifying novel relationships, or specifying boundary conditions, or even contesting some of the existing assertions within the body of that enabling theory. A very nice example is a recent paper by Tandy Thomas and Amber Epp, where they expanded, that is, they added a novel concept to the lens of practice theory. They wanted to better explain how practices can become habituated. And so they came up with the concept of envisioned practices. And this concept helped provide a link between pre-existing practices and how people translate them into their lives. So what's the difference between these two? In one case, the case I just talked about, which we refer to as furthering ongoing conceptual conversations, you are taking a conversation within marketing, such as the literature on branding, and advancing it using an enabling lens, such as practice theory or institutional theory, or you fill in the blank. And in the case of advancing enabling theory, you're extending the enabling theory itself. So two options. We see this second option much more rarely in marketing. And interestingly, one of the theories the theory that it has most been used, that has been most advanced by marketers, I would argue, or by consumer researchers, is practice theory. And I think there's a very clear reason for that. Practice theory is really about day-to-day practices that people engage in. And those practices are intimately tied to production and consumption. So when the kind of topics that we are concerned with in marketing lend themselves well to getting a better insight on a theory like practice theory. Again, if there are questions about advancing the enabling theory or furthering ongoing conceptual conversations, I'm happy to come back to that in the Q&A. So let's push forward then with actually going about doing enabled theorizing. So what should you know about enabled theories before you use them at all? Well, the first thing to realize is that different theories enable differently. That is, the enabling theory you draw on might be good for some things and not so good for other things. And when you're considering using an enabling theory in a given research project, you need one that fits with your focal phenomenon, with your research question, and with the data that you have or can get. And just to give one illustration of what that means, some enabling lenses, such as institutional theory, are great for fairly macro level analysis of markets or fields. Others are much better suited to more micro level analyses, and practice theory is a good example there. While it takes into account the structures that inform day-to-day practices, its real focus is on the very micro level doings of ordinary people. So different theories enable differently. You can do different things with different theories. So that's the one thing you need to realize, and you need one that works for you, given what you're interested in, your focal phenomena, etc. A second thing to realize is that you will rarely ever, when you're doing enabled theorizing, draw on all the concepts of an enabling theory. For this reason, if then for no other, the things that we tend to use as enabling theories are usually broad, sprawling, much studied theories that multiple authors have contributed to or refined. So you're unlikely to draw on all of it. And when Diane and I were working with institutional theory, we only sampled a small set of the concepts that we could have used. But, and this is the key point, although you're never going to use all the aspects of an enabling theory, it's really important to know its ontological premises and if you're going to use it appropriately. I would argue that you should know more about the enabling theory than you actually use, but at a minimum, understanding its ontological premises. What does it assume? What is its goal? What is it trying to illuminate? That's really important. And a third hint, tip, whatever, You can combine enabling theories, and we see lots of evidence of people doing so. However, their ontologies should be complementary. So go back up to the previous point. You have to understand their ontologies. And if you're going to combine enabling theories, comparable ontologies is really helpful. The other thing to note is that if you're going to use enabled theorizing, there are only so many theories and concepts you can use in a paper. And I have been a reviewer on many, many papers where I found authors were sampling very selectively from 3 or 4 or 5 different enabling theories. And at some point, it just gets to be too much. So more is not better when it comes to enabling theories. However, there are some times when you need more than one to do what you want to do. Again, happy to answer questions about this, because when I've given talks like this before, I know this is the question that comes up quite a bit. So when do enabling theories enable you, and how should they get into the research process? Well, the when question is an interesting one. And in the paper that Pierre and Robin and I published, we actually had the luxury, the privilege of interviewing many of our peers who have been using enabling theories in most of their research. And it was really interesting to see the variety in how people approached it. Some people, like, and I'll name her, though we don't in the paper, Hope Scow is a great one. Like, if you talk to Hope Scow, she will tell you that she sees practice theory everywhere. And so for her, it's quite likely that when she starts a research project, she's thinking of that enabling theory right from the outset. Others of us probably have a small catalog of enabling theories that we're familiar with, that we go to frequently. So there's no one right thing here. But as to the when they enter in, we find a lot of variability in this in terms of what people say they do. Some people start to introduce an enabling theory early on when they're identifying their original research questions or when they're refining them. Some do it at their point when they're starting to decide what data to collect, or when they're considering what additional data to collect after a very preliminary early stage of data collection that's just more open and exploratory. Often, and I think these are the most common things, I would say, it enters in during rounds of coding and analysis. I would say it might enter in initial rounds. It might be even more common for it to enter later rounds of an analysis. And the other possibility, which I have recently experienced myself, is that a paper that didn't get submitted with an enabling theory can find one entering in during the review process. In other words, I have submitted papers without an enabling theory. And I have been told by reviewers that I needed to introduce one. So when reviewers tell you they want an enabling theory, then you introduce it during the review process. But it's clear, I think, from this that there's no one right time or way to use an enabling theory. You're going to do what's right for you. Another question that I think is worth considering is, how do you select the right enabling theory? Well, for some researchers, they're so embodied that they use that same research perspective on every project. But for others, the selection process is quite strategic, quite deliberate. When we were doing our interviews for the paper that was published in Marketing Theory, we were interested to hear, because it wasn't something that we had done, but for some people, their goal in deciding what enabling theory to use is to find something that's novel. They feel that they maximize their chances of publication if they introduce not just a novel research question, but a previously unused enabling theory that hasn't previously been used by authors that target the same journals. That's not something that I personally do, but some people seem to do that to great effect. More common, and this is what I do. When I'm approaching a research project, will quite deliberately try out different lenses. So I might start with an institutional theory lens, but I will put it aside and ask myself or my co-authors, well, what would we get? How would it work if we looked at this through a Bourdieusian lens rather than a neo-institutional lens? Or if we looked at it through an assemblage theoretic perspective rather than through an institutional theory perspective. These different enabling lenses offer different vocabularies, different concepts. They'll bring different things to light. And so that is how I go about selecting what enabling theory to use in any given project. I quite frequently will go, all the way through creating an elaborate PowerPoint that uses one enabling theory. I'll present that to an audience and I'll realize that no, that's the wrong enabling theory. I'm going to get more out of trying a different one because this one's not working. So it's very much, for me anyway, a trial and error process if I'm going to use one at all. Also, often reviewers will recommend enabling theories that are different than those used on initial submission, and authors vary quite a bit in the way they react to this. You don't always have a choice in the review process. If you want to continue to get advancing through the review stages, you may have to switch. But I also know a lot of people who stick to their guns and say, no, I'm going to defend the use of this enabling lens because it is the one that's right for me. Here are some points about what you should avoid doing when it comes to enabling theories. Do not force fit data to a theory. I think some of the complaints that have arisen about enabled theorizing have come when people have read submissions or even published papers where it seemed that there was a kind of superficiality to the fit between the theory and the research question or the theory and the data. If you don't need an enabling theory, I guess I would argue, don't use one. Always think, could I get away without one? Because that way, at least you know you're not force fitting it. A second piece of advice I would have is that if you are thinking about using a theory and you've tried it out and you're finding that it helps you make sense of some of your data, but not most of it, it's probably the wrong theoretical lens. And it's hard to explain exactly how you know when it's not, when it's making sense of only a small portion of your data. But as a simple rule of thumb, if you've got, 5 transcripts and there's only one interview where the enabling theory really helps you understand it better, it's probably the wrong one. Another piece of advice is don't use the enabling theory superficially. So even if they fit your data, your research question, even if they are applicable to a large portion of your data, it is possible to be quite superficial in the use of them. And so again, I go back to saying, know the theory that you're using really well. It doesn't mean you have to use a lot of it, but use what you do use well. As an example, I've read a lot of papers that want to use the concept of institutional logics, but that don't really offer evidence of an institutional logic when they use the term. That's what I mean by using theory superficially. And one more point I make, don't you be the reviewer that insists that authors should use an enabling theory. If you're involved in a review process, try to refrain from insisting that authors use an enabling theory if they don't have one, and try to refrain from suggesting they switch if you possibly can. These are tools that are, I would argue, almost as unique as the people who use them. And what I mean by that is that institutional theory doesn't change from person to person. What it brings to light may vary from person to person. So the right theoretical lens for you might not be the right theoretical lens for the person whose paper you're reviewing. Just a couple of final points. Much of the most cited and generative qualitative research in our field has drawn on enabling theories. So I'm thinking here of papers like Susan Fournier's brand relationship theory paper, or Al Muniz and Tom O'Gwen's paper on brand communities. If you look carefully and read those papers, you'll see the footprint of very clearly developed enabling theories that allowed them to make the contributions they had made that have been so productive. So a lot of impactful work has used enabling theories, but so has a lot of work that has low impact and never gets published at all. So what's my point? My point is that using an enabling lens is no guarantee to making a high quality contribution. It can be conducive, but it isn't the right thing in all situations. And I said I was going to keep repeating it, so I'm not lying. I think this is about the 10th time I've said it. You do not need an enabling lens to build new theory through qualitative data, but if you choose to use enabling theory building, I hope these comments are useful. And with that, a little earlier than I thought, but I am going to end my formal presentation. I'd be happy to chat through the Q&A.
Thank you, Eileen, for such a generous and so practical set of advices on using enabling theory. I think people are still processing all of it. So don't forget, you can post your question in the chat. I don't know, I don't think participants can raise hands, but Isabella might be able to confirm that. In the meantime, I will ask a question. Usually researchers, they, oh, there's a question coming here. So I'll prioritize that and I can come back to my question later. Atik Raouf is asking, how is your coding affected by using an enabling theory prior to coding versus using one after coding?
So if you're using an enabling theory prior to coding, what that probably means is that some of your a priori codes are going to be codes that relate to constructs from the theory. So just to stick with institutional theory, let's say institutional work is a concept that you're drawing on for a particular analysis. And if you know institutional theory, you know that there's multiple types of institutional work. So you might have a priori codes that correspond to the different types of institutional work that you would see. So those then would be ones that might or might not earn their way into your analysis ultimately, but you would have that on your list of a priori codes before you go into the coding of your data. If you're introducing it at a later stage of coding, the norm, in my experience, what has happened is that you didn't go in with an enabling lens, but you're reading your own, you're looking at your own codes, you're starting to try and make sense of them. And a sense of familiarity goes, wait a minute, this really reminds me of fill in the blank theory. If I think of these things that emerge through open coding through the lens of fill in the blank theory, I'm going to maybe change my coding names, and then I'm going to start looking for connections or other instances of concepts, of related concepts coming in. So when it's recoding, it's often reinterpreting some of the codes that you already had through the lens of the enabling theory that you're drawing on. But if I may add just one caveat, just because you use that enabling theory for some of your codes, it doesn't mean that all of your codes need to be influenced by the enabling lens.
Thank you. We have another question from João Felipe Sauer-Brown. Could you give us an example of a work that does not use an enabling theory that you consider relevant?
Well, I was anticipating that question, and I did not have time to go back and search through the journals for stuff that hasn't used an enabling theory, but I want to tell you a story because I said I had one. So Marie-Agnès Parmentier and I recently published a paper in the Journal of Marketing on person brands, professional brands. And when we did that, when the original submission of that paper had no enabling theory in it, we had our research questions, we open coded our data to answer our research questions. It was a 10-year process to getting those research questions, by the way, lest you think it was some simple overnight thing. But we worked with our data, we gathered the data, we knew what we wanted to talk about, and we submitted that paper with no enabling theory. In the review process, reviewers insisted that we have to have one. And if you go back and read that paper, what we use is something called field theory, which is a very broad conception of concepts. It's almost like a buffet of concepts that we sampled from and basically retrofitted our analysis to concepts from that theory because we were asked to do so. But that paper, the analysis itself did not change one iota. We just put different labels on stuff. So I'm not embarrassed to have done that. You do what you do to get through the review process, but have a look at that paper and imagine that we weren't using the labels from field theory, but we're just using labels that were more specific to the conversation on person branding. And you would see an example of a paper that didn't really need an enabling lens. And I have to say that, I've said don't use one superficially. Well, we use that enabling lens really superficially in that paper because we were forced to introduce it. So there's a little insider tip for you.
We actually have a question, an anonymous question that really follows up very nicely to this one. What would be the appropriate answer to a reviewer that keeps questioning the author's choice of theory X instead of theory Y?
Well, I think, one solution is to go with what the reviewer is suggesting, but I'm assuming that's not what you want to hear. So I think the other approach to do it is to using your revision notes strategically to say, thank you so much for that suggestion. And I went a certain way down the road in doing that. However, when I used that enabling lens instead, it prevents me from, making use of the concepts from the enabling theory I have been using effectively. It makes for an analysis that doesn't illuminate the dynamic, the process, the constructs, the variables, whatever you want, as effectively. So I think illustrating your attempt to code using that enabling theory might be the way. So I feel the art of using revision notes in a polite and detailed way, you might not win over that reviewer, but you may very well be able to win over the AE or the editor. So there's a general rule of doing revisions, which is overwhelm your reviewers with your responsiveness, but you don't have to do it in the paper. You can do it in the revision notes. You could put appendices in your revision notes where you show your effort to go the direction you were suggested to go, but ultimately chose not to. Does that feel productive? Maybe not, but this is the game we play.
Thank you. If you have follow-up questions for Eileen, please feel free to also post in the Q&A. I'm happy to ask them. We have a couple of questions here that are related to combining enabling theories, as you rightfully anticipated. So Jose Santana is saying, thank you for the enlightening lecture, Eileen. Coming back to the definition of enabled theory you presented, you mentioned theories in the plural, and you also mentioned that we can combine enabling theories, but cautiously. What are the common pitfalls when combining enabling theories?
Right. This is such a good question. I think that the most common, pitfall is, and I will be honest, Robin and Pierre and I struggled with this because we kind of disagree a little bit about it. So can you combine an enabled theory that assumes structure with one that assumes no structure? So can you, for example, combine an assemblage theoretic perspective with an institutional theory perspective? These have really different premises, these two theories. An assemblage theory perspective assumes no particular structure. It's very organic. No thing is at a higher level than another. Whereas in an institutional theory perspective, we have these overarching logics and institutions, and then we have people embedded in the institutional thing. Like, these two things have very different ontologies, and can you reconcile them? All I will say is this: I think if you're going to try and do that, you have your work cut out for you. There's many compatible theories. Like, so when Diane and I were working on the Fashionista paper, we were asked by the reviewers and the associate editor to integrate a Bourdieusian perspective with an institutional theory perspective. That worked very well. They're very complementary. There are different families of concepts for sure, but there was nothing in tension between them at all. So I hope that helpfully answers the question. But I think it's like when the assumptions are in tension between two theories, I think that's the time when you're going to run into trouble. There's probably, I think my own experience as a reviewer would lead me to say this: the problem is less often that people are combining incompatible theories than that they're trying to use too many. And that's often a sign that they're being used really superficially. Like also, well, I should have put this in my presentation, but I'm glad to stumble upon remembering to say this. Sometimes what happens in the review process is that you're using a term that is very theoretically loaded for reviewers that you're not meaning to use in a theoretical way at all. Let me give you an example: sense making. There's a big body of theory on sense making that was, you can trace back to Carl Weick amongst other people, and it's a very interesting sense making, sense giving, fascinating field. If you talk about sense making in an analysis, but you're not touching on the sense making literature, you run the risk of people saying, well, how are you using sense making? Where's your review of the conceptual inventory of sense making? Blah 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 blah. So sometimes it happens that you introduce unwittingly an additional an enabling lens that you didn't mean to, and I don't think people should be held accountable for that. But in review process, like what I would say is that get friendly readers to read for you, and be asking them if there was any cues or bells or alarms that went off where you were using a conceptually laden term without intent. Practice is another term. I've been dinged by this in the review process. Sometimes when you say the word practice, you just mean behavior, you performance. You don't mean practice as in practice theory. Unfortunately, there's a bit of a vigilante group of reviewers out there who, if you even use the word practice once in the thing, will think you're using practice theory when you're not. So word to the wise, be careful what you do what you do intentionally.
And would you, in this case, for instance, that you're using the word practice as a word rather than trying to use practice theory as enabling lens, would you advise then to be open about it when you do the first submission in the letter to the journal?
Well, there's very little point in being open about it in your first letter because the reviewers won't see it. So my own personal strategy, when I know a word has a trigger effect like practice, I just avoid using it. I will use the term performance, hoping that no one thinks then that I'm using performativity theory or strategy or tactic, things that are just less conceptually loaded.
Thank you. The other question about combining different theories comes from Benjamin Rosenthal. Hi, Eileen, always great to see you presenting. Can you give us a few advice on how to use two enabling theories in a paper? What are good examples of that in CCT research?
Well, because, where my thinking is recently, as I said, Diane and I used Bourdieu and institutional theory in the fashionistas paper. Have a look there. I think you'll see that institutional theory was much more pronounced, but we were asked to introduce Bourdieu, so we did. So I think that might provide you, Benjamin, with a model for how to do it. But I think if you were going in and intentionally doing it, then I think in your enabling lens section, which most papers that use an enabling lens would have, you're going to say, use headings, use subheadings, be very clear and explicit in it, and say to your readers, say to the reviewers, this was why it was necessary to do these two things. Oh, I know another good paper that does it. Yes, a great example. It's the paper by Amber Epp, Belinda Price, and Hope Scow. I think all three of them are on it. Published in the Journal of Marketing. It integrates practice theory with, I'm just blanking on the other theory that they use, but it's a beautiful example. I think it's even better than mine with Diane. Have a look at that one. It's on when families become geographically distributed. So they used to have co-located practices, but they moved to different cities and they're trying to maintain their practices in geographically different ways. So that's a great paper that explicitly and purposively from the outset combined two enabling lenses. So have a look at that one. And then they're really clear on the limits of practice theory. They're really clear on why they had to introduce the other enabling lens, which for the moment is just escaping me, but look at that paper.
Actually, people are curious to hear more about the Scaraboto and Fisher 2013. So you commented that the reviewer suggested Foucault as an enabling theory. What were the challenges there, and what were the key points for the argument for the use of institutional theory in this case?
So that paper had institutional theory in from the outset, and anticipating that reviewers might want us to use the other theories. We didn't think that they would ask us to use Bourdieu, and in retrospect, I don't know why we didn't anticipate that, but Foucault, no way. So at the outset of that paper, if you read it carefully, you'll see that there's a moment very close to the introduction where we say why we didn't use new social movements theory, why we didn't use a theory of co-optation, and why we borrow from both of those a little bit, but ultimately use institutional theory. So there's before we introduce institutional theory, we dismiss the other ones. When in the review process, when reviewers suggested Bourdieu, there was really very little difficulty in doing that. It was actually a good suggestion. It did, and this is what, enabling theories do. It did give us a vocabulary and some insights that we didn't have before the review process. So that was great, and we were happy to do that. But when a reviewer suggested that we should be using a Foucauldian lens, and both Bourdieu and Foucault were suggested in the first round, we used the opportunity to say this, but not that. Like Foucault just didn't make sense. It focused us narrowly on power, which at the end of the day was only a tiny portion of what we wanted to talk about in that paper. Like, yes, these were less powerful actors, but then what? Like Foucault would, sure, it would help us understand that. But, frankly, what it didn't help us understand was how these consumers garnered whatever measure of power they did have by harnessing, various institutional tactics, if you will. So, I think it helped that we were being responsive and saying, yep, Bourdieu, for sure, tick, that's great, we'll do it. And it gave us the opportunity, it showed that we were being responsive, but it also gave us the leverage to push back against using Foucault. The reviewer who suggested that and continued to try and insist upon it through the entire review process, but the AE and the editor did not take their side.
Thank you. It's so nice to hear the backstage process stories. We learned so much from it. We have a question related to decolonizing efforts. We're trying to insert theories from the Global South into our papers. From your experience as an editor, how welcome is this effort? Bear in mind that these authors have never published in English.
I think you're going to find considerable receptivity to theories from the Global South. You will be doing educative work. So on the one hand, you have, increasing sensitization to issues of colonization and the need for decolonization working in your favor. You also have working in your favor the novelty that these theories probably represent for readers of the journal, and so it's something fresh. So that's great. But the disadvantage is that you have more education work to do. In particular, you have you need not only familiarize readers with the concepts, but you need to, frankly, I'll say it bluntly, you probably need to do a bit of selling on why it's powerful to do that. So I wouldn't justify my use of such an enabling perspective simply because it's the right thing to do. You also want to show that it's a powerful thing to do, that it shows us something that might otherwise be obscured from view. And that's what enabling theories do. For example, they probably show ways in which groups are marginalized or left out in ways that other theoretical perspectives would not. So it needs to fit. Thank you. That's the one. I see Isabella has got the
paper you were mentioning before by Amber App, Hope Scow, and Linda Price. Thank you, Isabella. I have a question for you, Eileen. I feel like most researchers generally publish mostly or even solely in their own fields, Whereas I have this impression you've developed this very rare ability to navigate multiple fields successfully. You've published in marketing, but you also published in top journals in, let me call it, organization studies, management. So to what extent do you think this navigation has shaped your understanding and use of enabling theories?
Oh, profoundly. Thank you, Luciana. That's a really interesting question. I mean, certainly because I'm constantly visiting multiple academic worlds, admittedly, mostly within the business school. There's many worlds out there that are fascinating that lie outside my realm, but it's probably introduced me to theories that I otherwise wouldn't have learned about or wouldn't have learned about as early. It's also, illustrated for me the ways that those theories can shed light on phenomena that our field should be concerned about, but isn't yet. Also, and this is the other thing, and again, I'll just illustrate it by example. I think reading in more than one field has often driven me crazy because I see analysis in the management field of what are essentially consumer phenomena, which barely acknowledge what we do and barely acknowledge, for example, the agency of consumers. Their role is just vastly under-theorized. That is both annoying and an opportunity. So when you read stuff in the management journals and see, well, but they're ignoring consumers, they're ignoring consumption, they're ignoring consumption culture. That can be quite inspiring for what you might do to correct that in our own journal, like by publishing in our own journals. You don't have to publish there to take advantage of the limits of their insights. So I don't know that I would recommend that anybody be as much of a dilettante as I have been in terms of trying to have a toe in too many fields and publish in too many journals. I'm not sure that that's been the most productive thing I could have done, but it's what I did. And so to answer your question, I think it has been of a benefit for me in that way. It's broadened my vocabulary and made me see some gaps that need filling.
And do you see between these fields, do you notice different enabled theory building practices? For instance, what do I mean here? Either researchers' usage of enabling theories, or also the way that reviewers assess work that used enabling theories and react to it. Do you notice differences?
I do, and that's a really interesting question too. So for whatever reason, I think consumer research and marketing has a much more open tolerance for the explicit use of enabling theories. So if you explicitly say in the pages of JCR or JM or JMR, I'm going to use, assemblage theory to understand how brands prosper or perish. No one bats an eye at that. Now, they might not agree you should use assemblage theory. They might, say, you should be using practice theory or whatever. But the notion that you're using an enabling lens and explicitly doing so is not controversial in most marketing journals that I'm familiar with. I don't see an open or explicit acknowledgement of the use of enabling theories in the management journals. I see people doing it, but they don't have a name or a vocabulary for talking about it, and they're usually much less explicit about it. And in fact, I think that they often tie themselves up in knots by trying to both claim that this analysis was completely grounded in the data and draw on an enabling lens. And how can it be completely grounded in the data if you're using an enabling lens? Clearly, there was some abductive thinking that came about from using an external enabling lens. So I do see differences in terms of the explicitness with which enabling theories are used. I will also say that the we've talked mostly about contributing to ongoing conversations, but if we talk about contributing to the enabling theories themselves, obviously the enabling theories that management scholars can contribute to are different than the ones we do. So they are in a much better position, I think, than we are to contribute to institutional theory, just because of the level of the phenomena that they work at. But yeah, those are some of the differences I see. There's also other methodological differences in qualitative research between the two fields, but I'll stop my answer there because I could probably go on for hours and hours and hours.
Oh, we still have a couple of minutes if you want to talk more about that.
No, that's okay.
Oh, it seems like you have an idea for a research paper calling for management scholars to be more explicit in using their enabling theories there.
You've guessed it. You've nailed it, Luciana.
All right. Eileen, thank you so much for sharing these pieces of advice and detailed, pragmatic insight into using enabling theory. It's been a true pleasure.
Thank you so much for having me. And I wish I was there in person with all of you, but I know you're not together with one another either. So let me just say, I hope to see each and every one of you in person somewhere, sometime in the not too distant future.
I second that. For those continuing the event, I want to remind you that we have an amazing last round of panelists at 4 p.m. With Karim Brondino Pompeu, Marcelo Rezende, and Marcos Emais, and Maribel will be moderating this session. Thank you so much. Bye.